All right, so today we're diving into the work of Friedrich Hayek.
Oh, Hayek.
Yeah, and he's a really interesting thinker. You know, he wasn't just focused on one thing like some of the other big names we look at.
Like a hedgehog.
Exactly. Yeah, he was more of a fox.
That's right, yeah.
Moving from the philosophy of science to political philosophy.
Yeah.
You know?
Even thinking about free will and epistemology.
Yeah.
A real intellectual renaissance man.
A real renaissance man, yeah.
And this is kind of remarkable.
Yeah.
His most influential work, the work that earned him a Nobel Prize, revolved around one central theme.
Spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order, exactly.
And this is what we're going to be diving deep into today.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting for our listeners out there who are, interested in philosophy.
Yeah.
This champion of these systems arising organically.
Without a top-down control.
Without this top-down control, was also a pretty big critic of social justice.
Interesting tension there.
A real tension there.
How can you have both of these things?
And that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Yeah.
To really grasp how Hayek understands spontaneous order.
Right.
And how that then connects to his skepticism towards social justice.
Yeah, and we're going to be doing this mainly through the lens of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Hayek.
Okay.
It gives us a really good overview of all his core arguments.
And that's going to be our jumping off point today.
And we're going to break those down in a way that I think makes sense.
For a philosophical mind.
For a philosophical mind.
Absolutely.
Who wants to really get into the logic.
The logic, yeah.
And identify some of the points where you might want to push back.
All right, so let's start with spontaneous order.
Okay.
What exactly did Hayek mean by that?
Okay, so when he says spontaneous order, he's talking about the emergence of these orderly structures that come about from the actions of lots of individuals, but they aren't designed by any one person or group.
Like there's no architect behind them.
Exactly. Think about how language emerged.
Okay.
No one sat down.
And planned out English.
And invented English or Mandarin, right?
Right.
They evolved through countless interactions.
Over a really long time.
Over centuries. Yeah. An ongoing process.
Hayek saw the market in the same way.
Absolutely.
So just to kind of sum up what we've talked about so far.
Sure.
It's the idea that these complex, intricate systems that work so well can arise naturally without a blueprint.
Without an architect.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
He contrasted this idea with what he called design arguments.
Yeah. Okay.
So for Hayek, it was wrong to say that the order we see in nature must mean there's a divine designer.
Okay.
He thought it was wrong to say that the order in society must be from human planning.
Okay.
Like conscious human planning.
Intentional design.
So the power isn't in the top down, but in the bottom up.
Yeah, and this is a key mental shift Hayek wants you to make.
Really rethinking how order emerges.
Totally.
So this order doesn't have to be perfectly efficient, right?
Yeah, that's crucial.
It just has to work.
It just has to function.
Yeah, like languages.
Like think about how English has developed.
It's got quirks.
Oh, many.
It's got these weird redundancies.
Yeah.
But we all understand each other.
It still works.
For the most part.
Yeah. And this is what Hayek emphasized.
Cool.
That these orders, they can become really sophisticated and they work incredibly well.
Yeah.
Think about how language adapts to new concepts, new ways of thinking.
Yeah.
But they don't have to be perfectly optimal in some, theoretical sense.
Right.
They're more like adaptations that have been tested.
Over time. Okay, so beyond just this idea of arising without design.
Right.
What are some other important characteristics of spontaneous order?
Yeah, so Hayek highlights a few.
Okay.
One of the most important is unpredictability.
Unpredictability.
Yeah, remember how natural selection works?
Okay.
It acts on random mutations.
Yeah.
The path of evolution is unpredictable.
Yeah.
Even if we understand the basic mechanisms at work.
Yo.
Hayek thought social and cultural evolution were similar.
Driven by these unpredictable factors.
Right. Innovations, shifts in preferences, unforeseen events.
So all these things reshape people's plans.
Exactly.
And lead to these unexpected outcomes.
Outcomes we could never have predicted.
So even with hindsight, we can't really fully grasp how things unfolded.
Right.
He even suggests that there's a kind of chaos at play here.
Chaos,
yeah.
Yeah, so we might be able to make broad predictions.
Okay.
Like, we know if the money supply increases dramatically, we'll probably see inflation.
Yeah.
But we can't predict the exact price of, let's say, milk next year.
Or which new technology will be the big hit.
Exactly. Yeah. The system is just too complex.
With too many moving parts.
Okay, so we've got unpredictability.
Okay.
What else is there?
So another key aspect is this idea of decentralized information.
Decentralized information.
And how prices play this critical role.
Prices as signals.
Prices as signals.
Okay.
This is fascinating.
Yeah.
Because prices convey information that no single person or authority
could ever fully know.
Could ever possess.
Okay, so can you give us an example?
Yeah, imagine trying to figure out the optimal use of, let's say, tin.
Tin?
Yeah, tin.
Okay.
Across all its possible uses and locations.
Globally.
Globally, it's impossible.
For one person or group to know all of that.
Right, to have all that knowledge.
Yep.
But the price of tin does something really cool.
Okay.
It takes all these factors, the supply, the demand, the alternative uses, and it kind of boils them down into a single signal.
The price.
The price.
Okay.
If tin becomes scarce, the price goes up. And that tells people to use less of it. Even if they don't know why it's become scarce.
Exactly.
They just see the price and react.
Hayek had this great analogy. Okay. Said that someone setting the price of rice is like them dictating what words we should use to talk about rice.
So it's like controlling language.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really striking.
It highlights how prices are a form of communication.
A form of communication, yeah.
They guide our actions.
Based on this knowledge that's spread out.
Disperse.
Among so many people.
Exactly.
And this then connects to the emergence of community.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's not just these isolated transactions.
No, at all.
It's actually the creation of these complex networks of cooperation, even among people who are complete strangers.
Yes, even strangers.
Who might not even speak the same language.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about...
So the global market for something as simple as tin, it brings together miners, smelters, manufacturers, consumers, and they all cooperate through these price signals.
Okay, so we have a picture of spontaneous order.
Yeah.
But Hayek was also critical of planned orders.
Yeah, he thought they were just fundamentally inferior.
Okay, why is that?
Well, here's where Adam Smith comes in.
Okay.
You know, Adam Smith, the famous economist, he had this idea of the man of system who thinks he can arrange society like pieces on a chessboard.
So like a central planner.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But Smith's point, and Hayek agreed with him completely, was that unlike chess pieces, people have their own motivations, knowledge, plans.
They're not just pawns to be moved around.
Exactly.
So central planners can't just dictate everything.
They can't ignore the fact that people have agency.
Okay, and a big part of this is the problem of information.
Yes, information is key.
But it's not just that it's hard to gather all the information.
It's more than that.
It's something deeper.
Hayek argued it's actually impossible.
Impossible!
To get all the information you would need for effective central planning because it's constantly changing. It's constantly changing.
It's subjective.
It's subjective.
Yeah.
Prices are created through the process of exchange.
They don't just exist out there.
Exactly. Yeah. Planner is always working with old data.
Outdated information?
That's like trying to catch smoke.
With a net.
With a net, yeah.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see what you mean.
So imagine a planner trying to allocate resources.
Okay.
They know there's a demand for wire and jewelry. How do they decide whether to use copper for wire or platinum?
Right.
Gold for jewelry or silver?
Without knowing the relative scarcity of those metals?
Exactly. And the intensity of people's preferences.
So they're just guessing.
They're shooting in the dark.
And then there's the problem of demand.
Oh, yeah.
When consumers aren't paying directly.
Like in a centrally planned economy, demand becomes almost infinite.
Right, because they're not feeling the cost.
Exactly.
So the planner's main concern is just containing costs.
But without a real measure of what those costs actually mean.
Is one car really worth 10 refrigerators?
A planner doesn't have the information to make that kind of judgment.
It's all arbitrary.
Pretty much.
And Hayek argued that even with computers,
even with supercomputers,
this problem wouldn't go away.
No, it wouldn't.
Okay, why not?
Because the information doesn't exist until it's generated by the market.
Ah, so it's not about the processing power.
Yeah.
It's about the lack of the information itself.
Precisely.
So the act of buying and selling creates the information.
Yeah, that process of sellers figuring out what people want.
Yeah.
And buyers figuring out what they're willing to pay.
Yeah.
That's what generates the information that prices then reflect.
So the market is almost like a giant information processing machine.
In a way, yes.
Okay, so this is almost paradoxical.
It is.
Hayek is suggesting that the best thing a central planner could do is to copy the prices that would emerge in a free market.
Pretty much,
Which completely defeats the purpose of central planning.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to Hayek's view on law. He talks about law providing a stable ecological niche.
Yeah, this is a great analogy.
Okay, what does he mean by that?
Okay, so think about a species evolving.
Okay.
It needs a stable environment to adapt to.
Right.
That's what Hayek thought law did for humans.
So it provides this stable framework.
Yeah, a set of rules that people can rely on.
So they can experiment and innovate and come up with successful strategies.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in this view, the government's role is like a referee.
Okay.
Not a player.
So it's about maintaining a fair process.
Yes.
Not trying to control specific outcomes.
Exactly. He believed in establishing clear rules and then letting the game play out.
Okay.
He emphasized that law should evolve organically.
Like common law.
Like common law.
Yeah.
Through experience and tradition.
He wasn't a fan of grand schemes.
No, he was suspicious of central plans that aimed for specific results.
Right.
Because those plans ignore the complex realities on the ground.
And they can have these unintended consequences that are often worse than the original problem.
Yeah, that's a big theme in Hayek's work.
So law should be more like a garden.
Okay.
Where you create the right conditions, but then let things grow naturally.
Instead of trying to sculpt every single plant.
Exactly.
He also cautioned against politicians getting too ambitious.
Okay.
Enacting laws that benefit small groups at the expense of the general population.
Right.
He called this the problem of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs.
Concentrated benefits, dispersed costs.
Yeah, it's a really important concept because often the people who benefit from a law are very aware of the benefits.
Right.
But the costs are spread out among so many people.
That no one really notices them.
And so no one really opposes the law.
It's like a hidden tax.
Yeah, kind of.
And this is where he draws a distinction between common law and legislation.
Right.
Common law evolves slowly.
Through specific cases.
Yeah.
It's more grounded in practice. Whereas legislation is more top-down.
Yeah.
It can be driven by ideology.
Or special interests.
Exactly. So it's more prone to those unintended consequences.
Okay, so now let's get to the really controversial part.
Okay.
Hayek's critique of social justice.
Right. He famously called it a mirage.
A mirage.
And this might be confusing for some people.
Especially for philosophers.
Yeah.
Who tend to think a lot about justice.
So it's crucial to understand what Hayek was actually criticizing.
Okay.
When he said social justice. He was mainly talking about distributive justice.
Distributive justice.
The idea that justice means actively creating a specific distribution of wealth, income, whatever.
Okay.
His central argument was this.
Yeah.
He said, there can be no distributive justice where no one distributes.
There can be no distributive justice.
Where no one distributes.
Right.
Meaning that in a free market,
yeah.
the outcomes we see, they're not the result of some central authority.
Making conscious decisions about who gets what.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're the result of countless voluntary exchanges between individuals.
So no one is actively distributing in the sense that Hayek means it.
Right.
So the very concept of a just distribution doesn't really apply.
Because there's no distributor.
So the market isn't the kind of thing that can be just or unjust.
Not in the way that a deliberate act can be.
Right, like an act of theft or discrimination.
Exactly.
Okay.
Hayek was really skeptical of this idea of a merit czar.
Who would decide who deserves what?
Yeah, like some central authority.
Okay.
Who would intervene based on their own idea of merit.
So he wasn't saying that market outcomes are always perfect?
No, not at all.
Or that there's never any need for intervention?
But he thought the market itself is not the kind of thing that can be judged as just or unjust.
In the same way that we judge actions.
Right.
So this is where he diverges from someone like Rawls.
Yeah, Rawls was concerned with
addressing natural inequalities.
Yeah, inequalities that arise just from luck.
And Rawls thought that just institutions
should try to mitigate those inequalities.
Okay.
But Hayek argued that if the initial distribution of talents and circumstances isn't itself unjust, then trying to correct the resulting market outcomes
isn't necessarily rectifying an injustice.
Exactly.
It's more like addressing bad luck.
Yeah, or misfortune.
Okay, so Hayek was worried about the consequences of pursuing social justice.
Yeah, he thought it could lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
Like what?
He thought it could create a climate of zero-sum politics.
Zero-sum politics.
Yeah, where people are constantly fighting
over existing wealth.
Instead of focusing on creating new wealth, He worried that talented people would waste their time trying to game the system.
To get a bigger share of the pie.
Instead of baking a bigger pie.
I see.
He much preferred solutions that made everyone better off.
Solutions that were mutually beneficial.
Exactly.
And voluntary.
Yes, voluntary.
Okay.
Instead of imposing solutions based on contested notions of justice.
Right, because there's no agreement on what a just distribution would even look like.
Exactly.
So it's likely to lead to conflict.
Yeah.
And this is why Hayek was such a strong supporter of constitutional democracy.
Right.
Because it limits the power of the majority.
To impose their own version of justice?
Everyone else.
Precisely.
Okay, let's talk about merit and economic reward.
Okay.
Hayek makes this distinction between inputs and outputs.
Yeah, this is really important.
That's the difference.
So for Hayek, merit was primarily about inputs.
Like effort.
Effort, intentions.
Okay.
But he pointed out that in a free society, people are actually rewarded for their outputs.
What they produce.
The value they create for others.
Okay.
And that value is reflected in what customers are willing to pay.
So it's not about how hard you work.
It's about what you produce.
It's about the results.
Exactly.
So he thought it was a mistake.
To think that justice requires rewarding inputs.
Instead of outputs.
Because ultimately it's the outputs that matter for society.
So you could work really hard on something no one wants.
And you wouldn't get rewarded.
Because you haven't produced anything of value.
He even used this term, economizing on merit.
Economizing on merit.
It's a bit of a strange term.
Okay.
But he meant that the market prioritizes the satisfaction of people's needs.
Regardless of the effort or intention behind it.
Exactly.
So the focus is on the results.
The results.
Not the intentions.
Hayek was also worried about these centralized systems that try to allocate rewards based on merit.
Because someone has to decide what's meritorious.
And those decisions are inevitably subjective.
It's like having a merit czar.
Exactly.
Who decides who gets rewarded.
And who gets punished.
A recipe for tyranny.
And Hayek thought it would lead to a sense of entitlement.
Among those who are deemed worthy.
Yeah, like they deserve special treatment.
And that could undermine the whole system.
Absolutely.
Okay, this connects to his views on fair practices.
Yeah, and this idea of a just price.
Which he rejects.
He completely rejects it.
Okay.
He thought it was a harmful idea.
Okay.
Hayek's perspective here aligns with some early work by Rawls on this idea of a practice.
A practice.
Yeah, like a game.
Okay.
Think about baseball.
Okay.
The value of the game comes from following the rules.
Right.
Not from making sure everyone wins.
Or that the good guys always win.
Exactly. That would ruin the game.
It would defeat the purpose.
So for Hayek, true fairness in the economic realm is about having impartial rules and letting the game play out according to those rules.
So it's about the process.
Yeah, the process.
Not about guaranteeing specific outcomes.
Or trying to correct for every inequality.
Okay.
Hayek really hated the idea of a just price.
Why is that?
He thought it hindered trade and prevented those mutually beneficial exchanges.
So it actually reduced overall well-being.
Yeah, he thought it was counterproductive.
Okay.
He believed that focusing on a just price gave prices this undue moral significance.
Right, like prices are just signals.
They're just information.
Okay.
They don't have inherent moral value.
And he uses Adam Smith's example of the butcher and the baker.
Yeah, the butcher and the baker.
They're not trying to be altruistic.
No.
They're just trying to make a profit.
But by doing so, they end up benefiting countless others.
Through the invisible hand of the market.
Exactly.
And Hayek's deeper concern
was that attempts to enforce fair prices would disrupt the whole system.
The price system.
Price system, which is how we allocate resources.
And that could lead to all sorts of problems.
Like shortages.
Like in the example of insulin and ice during a power outage.
Exactly.
If the price of ice is kept artificially low,
then it might not get to the people who need it most. Because the price isn't reflecting the true scarcity.
Okay, so finally, let's talk about Hayek's background in the Austrian School of Economics.
Yeah, this is really important.
How did that shape his thinking?
So, the Austrian school really emphasized institutions.
Like law and property rights?
Exactly.
And social norms?
And how those institutions shape economic behavior.
Okay.
They also stress this idea of methodological individualism.
Which is?
That economics is ultimately about individual choices and subjective values.
So it's not just about numbers.
No, it's about human behavior.
And how people perceive things.
And Austrian economists were very aware of the complexity of the market.
They weren't trying to create these grand theories.
No, they were more focused on the messy reality
of how people actually behave.
They were skeptical of too much math and economics.
Because it can oversimplify things.
Yeah, it can hide the role of creativity and innovation.
And the fact that the market is constantly changing.
Hayek saw the market as a process of discovery.
Not a static equilibrium.
Exactly.
So Austrian economics is all about understanding how individuals make choices within these complex institutions.
And how those choices then create the patterns we see in the economy.
Okay, so to sum up for our philosophically inclined listeners, what's the core message of Hayek's work?
Hayek's central argument is that spontaneous orders,
which are driven by individual choices?
And price signals.
Within a stable framework of law.
Are the best way to coordinate a complex society.
And generate prosperity.
He wasn't saying that spontaneous orders are perfect.
But they're better than the alternatives.
Especially central planning.
Right.
And Hayek was skeptical of social justice.
Specifically distributive justice.
Yeah.
Because he thought it would undermine these spontaneous orders and lead to all sorts of unintended consequences.
Like a loss of liberty.
And economic stagnation.
Exactly.
But it's important to remember that Hayek wasn't against all forms of social safety nets.
Right.
Or helping people who were suffering.
He was concerned with the dangers of central control and trying to engineer specific outcomes.
Based on these contested notions of justice?
He thought that was a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, here's a final thought to consider.
Okay.
Given everything we've talked about today, where do you draw the line?
Between addressing societal ills
and trying to engineer a specific distribution of outcomes.
Is it more important to have a fair process?
Or a specific result?
This is a complex question.
With no easy answer.
And it's something worth thinking about.
As you continue to explore these ideas.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
On The Deep Dive.
On The Deep Dive. Bye.